Extremely pleased to welcome our many distinguished guests from outside campus, excellencies, ambassadors of a number of countries in Latin America, faculty members, guests from the business and industry, but also our most favorite constituents, the students. And we have also representatives of a number of business associations on campus. Today, in fact this week, marks the beginning of the Willard W. Brown International Business Leadership Seminar Series. We kicked it off yesterday with a public seminar given by Dr. Carlos Winograd that was extremely well attended by the students across different schools and departments on campus. A very interesting topic was from Gutenberg to Facebook, issues that relates to conversions, deregulation, antitrust laws, competition, governance, and so on and so forth. But we also thought that besides the public seminar of yesterday, let's have sort of a focused roundtable discussion on a different topic. Globalization in Latin America, fragmentation and governance heading to 2050, with some insinuations, parallels, insights on the region that we live in. Extremely delighted to welcome you all on campus. This is the beginning of a seminar series that would last all the way until May 2020. The reason why we're doing the seminar series is that starting February 19 to May 2020, the university is celebrating 100 years. So we're celebrating our centennial. So this is our contribution to the university activities when it comes to the centennial festivities. You would expect, in the context of a higher education institution, the festivities will be courses and programs and seminars and things of that sort. So we're very fortunate and delighted to have Dr. Carlos Winograd with us this week. I will keep everybody posted of the upcoming events. And without further ado, I'd like to pass the floor to Ambassador Eduardo Barrera, the Ambassador of Argentina in Egypt.
Well, thank you, No, I won't take long because we want to give all the time for the presentation of Professor Willard. Just to say thank you to all of you, particularly my community ambassadors, Ambassador Normale, and just to thank again the School of Business of the University and Dr. Supérieure for their openness and university collaborating and allow us to collaborate with these two activities. We hope will be the beginning of some sort of cooperation slowly.
Thank you very much. Let me now pass the floor to Dr. Diano Dean, the Associate Dean for Graduate Studies and Research at the School of Business.
Thank you. I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to you all, and I have the pleasure of moderating the roundtable today. We are very fortunate to have Professor Winograd with us. I think it's a very, as Dean Kevin mentioned, it's a very good platform for us to exchange ideas and bring experiences from other regions and see how it relates to our region, especially involving all of the stakeholders in our society, be it business leaders, diplomats, scholars, and students as well. Professor Winograd, he has a very actually varied range of experience. Currently, he's a research fellow and professor at the Paris School of Economics. Previously, he was the Secretary of State for Competition, Deregulation and Consumer Affairs in the government of Argentina during the period 1999 to 2002. Professor Winograd, his approach to policy making at the time was very much based on information-based decision making and a very technical approach to that. His work on regulating and maybe deregulating a number of sectors and improving the competition and antitrust laws seen in Argentina, in electricity, telecoms, postal services, the oil sector, and the media. Yesterday he gave actually a very, very interesting presentation on these topics. He also has experience in macroeconomic policy coordination, not just for Argentina, but for the Latin American region in general, in the span of macro and fiscal policies. Today he will be talking to us about a wide range of issues ranging from macroeconomic policy coordination all the way up to institutional challenges that are facing the MENA region. And we're fortunate to be looking at a very long horizon up until 2050, and then during the discussion I hope we can see how this relates or affects our region in the Middle East. So without further ado, I give the floor to Professor Willard.
Thank you and bon appetit. I will prevent myself from eating because as a Latin I have a high risk of siesta driven post and that will endanger my only neuron working at its best. The first thing is as I said yesterday, I appreciate the invitation that came up from a casual discussion with Ambassador Eduardo Varela in Paris a month ago, when after this casual talk I didn't imagine it will end really of what he wanted, and I discovered what his subtle way of obtaining things, that you would think it's very gentle and it's very, at the end of the day he gets his and you don't know how, but you are there where he thought you should be. And yesterday I mentioned I was impressed because nobody gave me any hint. I didn't ask, true, because I probably thought I wouldn't come at the end, on the AUC, and I got to this infrastructure after 1 hour seeing New Cairo that when I was here about 20 years ago didn't exist, and I discovered this infrastructure and I was amazed. I discovered just 5 minutes ago that you imported a PhD from Paris School of Economics that I didn't know that was here, and I just met. And yesterday I mentioned that we made a big fest because our building was finished after 10 years of efforts of fundraising, and I arrived here and I said, well, it almost fits in 2 back rooms of this compound, and we are crazy. That didn't impede that BSc turned into top 10 university, sometimes in a nutshell. With a good accumulation of human capital, you can produce a lot of things. But today I had a second feeling, and it's how one gets accustomed. So I was in 24 hours, I took for granted what surprised me yesterday, and I thought in a second of how nations and societies can get comfort with success and not take the challenge of pushing, but can also get comfort with decay. And that's the thing of habit formation, transforming in institution building, is maybe a provocation for a discussion at the end about lessons from Latin America to Egypt. What am I doing here? Some time ago, I tried to, Argentina where I come, but Latin America as a whole, less so a lot of places of Latin America in the last 25 years, and we can discuss this in depth later, and there are ambassadors of countries. It was a region set by political and economic instability, macro instability and political instability. Today it's much less so. It's almost 30-35 years that the dominance of democratic regime legitimacy is there. Some have succeeded. Seems to be a precondition given the preferences of the societies for development, but not a sufficient condition. Some have succeeded in big progress, some did less. But I wanted to look beyond the short run, and some time ago I started to see things that are not usual for me. It's not standard macro, neither standard IO or regulation, and wanted to look forward. What are some fundamentals of the regions looking forward in the set of the current wave of globalization? And so you will see a lot of titles that don't sound standard macroeconomics and don't sound like yesterday standard regulation issues. For instance, fragmentation and trade specialization. What is happening? What does it mean, globalization, today? And how it will affect us? Is it the same? Are we talking all about the same concept? Second, social and economic challenges for the next generation. I'm looking forward 25 years, 30 years. What could be beyond inflation, fiscal deficits, etc., some of the challenges in the region with a telescopic view? And then natural resources and what I call a neo-Malthusian view of a global economy. Climate change and governance, it's all over the place. Now there is a breaking consensus because the Paris Agreement is challenged by the US, which is obviously still the main driver in international politics. Ethnicity and conflict, which is somehow in a large sense, if you incorporate, as I will do, religious aspects of fragmentation, something that can be very relevant, is very relevant for this region of the world. Urbanization, crime and violence. We are in the developing world seeing a process of massive urbanization. This is even stronger in this part of the world. It's more consolidated in Latin America, so you will react to this, which I'm no expert on the Middle East. And then some combination of this maybe unusual topics to put all together about governance. And governance is a central problem of development. So, just one transparency on the macro setup. If I'm not going to talk about macroeconomics, I must stand and say that macroeconomics, in my view, is a necessary condition. Macro stability is a necessary condition for growth and development. Very far from sufficient, but a necessary condition, because in a nutshell, macroeconomic instability contaminates political stability, and the two compounded increase the risk for business, for development, and for individual decisions. And when the discount rate for decisions goes very high because of the implicit risk, the investment in consumer process and all the decision process of the agents is altered in a negative way. We also know that in terms of distribution, inequality and poverty, macro instability in general tends to be biased against the poor and the disfavored. So we are again, for the emerging world, after the 2008 crisis, in a phase of what I call quantitative tightening as opposed to quantitative easing that was set after the 2008 crisis. And the question is, global growth is pushing forward in the US and rebounding in some European countries, but under tightening, we don't know very well the dynamics of growth in the coming future. We just know that now there is a flight to quality and emerging markets are being attacked in some places, the currencies, because of recomposition of world portfolios. Will Latin America, and I will focus on Latin America, and you keep in mind and think about the Middle East, and then you teach me after I finish about the Middle East experience on that. 10 years ago, a lot of people thought that Latin America was decoupling, because for the first time, Latin America had robust external situation and fiscal situation. the experience showed that if it was more robust, it was not decoupled from global trends. Today, decoupling is not even a discussion. It's obvious that Latin America will not decouple from the reversal in capital flows. So I say certainly not, because 10 years ago, a lot of people were believing that the arch door of Latin America was not only the commodity boom, but more that could go on its own. I always distrusted this view. Today, nobody will have the courage to say that Latin America can be a way. Well, so this will depend on global growth. Will it be sustained, or the current American policy on the one side, plus the secular stagnation of Japan, plus the dynamics of Europe, will lead to sustained growth, or this will be just a short period of growth set up by a future crisis once again. Too much public debt. The adjustment in the North to the crisis of 2008 was a strong public indebtedness. All the countries, I'm not going to discuss this here, but all the countries of the North have a level of debt to GDP that is over 70% and many approaching 100%. In a phase of increasing interest rates, the sustainability of these levels of debt may not only be a problem for the developing world, but may turn to be a problem for the developed world. There's not much discussion about that, and the developing world will not be safe if there is disruption in the world. Chinese uncertainties. China, which is today clearly a big actor of the international scene, is slowed down in its rate of growth, but still growing at around 6-7%, not anymore at 10, but 6-7%. For the current size of the Chinese economy, is a tremendous role in the global economy. China has problems in the banking sector. Will this keep under control, or may China also bring unsatisfactory news in the future? What happens with Latin America in this scene? Well, in Latin America, we're going to see very quickly that some countries are competitors of China, like Mexico, and some countries are complementary of China because providers of raw materials, typically the Mercosur and the Pacific area, Chile, Peru, with metals. So Latin America is not a one experience. And this, as the Middle East, for the non-Middle East people, they think it's all the same. It's a good first approach, but the diversity of situations in Latin America is probably the most interesting thing to look through if one wants to understand the region. Some of the issues I want to mention here is public finance and monetary stability. It will depend how long is the crisis in this period of high interest rates and what are the impact at the north. Chile, I would say, is the best off and the most robust economy in the regions in terms of macro, and Ambassador is smiling with a lot of pride, and I will be so, but just, this was not in the presentation, but just a surprise, I think that Chile has new challenges, typically the aspiration of the new middle classes in terms of education and health, that are challenging the political system, and we saw it in the last elections. And Ambassador can say later something about this. The consensus that drove Chile for the last 30 years may be at risk in the coming future in terms of social demands. Still, I will say that Chile is the best off, and we will see in many examples the Chilean experience is extremely interesting inside Latin America. There is a paradox and advantage is a lowly intermediated financially region, which on the one hand is bad for growth because we want a good and strong financial system to intermediate savings to investment and to get credit to the consumers for the development of a nation. But at the same time, there is a paradox. The less mortgage market you have, the less the risk of having a subprime type of mortgage market crisis. So there is no bad without good, there is no good without bad. employment and poverty is a region with a strong and secular inequality in the region. Even in the case that I mentioned of Chile, still inequality is very high, measured by any standard, even if in many Latin American countries poverty has been reduced dramatically in the last 20 years. There is a tendency to mix up in the popular discourse inequality and poverty. And this bruises the understanding of social events in an economy. An economy can be more or equally unequal, but the social change can be enormous, reducing poverty. The vulgar view of journalists in general mixes up these two things. In Latin America, it's an interesting experience of still very high inequality, but tremendous changes in poverty. From countries, ranging countries from Brazil to Peru, a country that had a secular poverty and polarization of society. Chile, once again, I don't want to turn Chile into the rock star of my presentation. If not, the other Latins will penalize me afterwards. And the same we see in other countries that had a lost fight against poverty for decades. Competition policies and protection, well, I'm asking, will we go back to the 30s? This certainly will handicap the developing economies. We are seeing star wars in trade between China and the US and Europe, a questioning of the free trade agreement between the US, Canada, and Mexico. Surprisingly enough, today there are more problems between the US and Canada than between the US and Mexico. That last week, I don't know next week, because the administration in the US has a high level of volatility in his handling of international and national affairs, but we have a lot of surprises there. But the issue is, can we get into a period of trade wars that derail the current status quo? Looking forward, we are, in macro terms, after the crisis, in super liquid markets. The degree of liquidity to fight the crisis of 2008 that was introduced in the global economy is has no equivalent in the past history of capitalism. This, I call this the Greenspan accommodation rule that was continued, in my way, in a very wise way, given the situation, by Bernanke, but it comes a time that we need monetary absorption, because later or sooner, inflation contaminates the global system. It seems that today is the later or sooner. How much, for how long, and what will be the impact? Extreme liquidity tends to avoid extreme catastrophe. The driver of this view, of this vision, is we don't want the 1930s once again. By an interesting thing is how intellectual development affects policy. Bernanke is one of the most reputed economic historians of the US, and he studied for ages the 1930 crisis. And everything that was driving him was not to repeat, and he avoided. However, no extreme catastrophe, but probably very frequent crises in one market, in one area, in one country, etc. Trade output and price volatilities. Well, what will be the long-term trends of the countries that have their comparative advantage in raw materials? And that's mainly us in this table. And that leads us to trade. What happens with global trade? So my macro introduction was a bit long, and now we are going to jump from today to decades forward. Well, we see something. Trade is more sensitive to income since the last economic crisis than before. Let's look at the elasticity of trade to income. It doubled between 1960s to the last 10 years. So it means that an increase in income of 1% has a double the effect on trade than it had years ago. So this is a show of globalization and the growth of trade in the mechanics of current capitalism. But we started in 2008 with creeping protectionism. Protectionism today is much more elegant than in the past. We call it food security, eco-security, green regulations, etc. In the aftermath of the 2008, we recall 50 protectionist measures by 17 G20 countries. And that was the times of Obama. That was a multilateralist. What is the type of extension that we can have under the current isolationist policy of the US? This is something to discuss. Protectionism is more targeted and less transparent. I don't have time, and I don't want Safa to discipline me too early, so I'm not going to tell an example, but once discussing with a trade negotiator in Japan, try to tell this story quickly, I said, but your car trade between Japan and the rest of the world is not completely open. He said, yes, it's completely open. Why do you say that? Well, I look at the share and it's surprising compared to other developing economies. He said, what happens? It said, well, maybe because the preferences of Japanese consumers are not the same. And what do you mean? Well, we need security. We are a very protective society. And he laughed in this very humble Japanese way of joking. And he said, you know, when we get a BMW in Japan, we crash it at 250 kilometers per hour and we see the impact. If it has a lot of problems, it's not secure enough for the Japanese consumer, and then for reasons of health, we stop the imports. So this is, you don't stop German cars, you just protect the security of your consumers. Global trade wars. Tariffs are negotiation tactics, curbing the US trade deficit as tit for retaliation. This could be, in a nutshell, some of the verbal argument by the Trump administration today. What is LATAM in all this? LATAM is Latin America in short. Well, how much will LATAM suffer from the protectionist outburst? In the short term, there are some simulations made at the World Bank very recently that, to our surprise, show that in the current phase, it doesn't seem to affect Latin America too much, the direct effect of trade wars. I'll make all this conditional because in the current phase and with the current characteristics of the trade war. In the long term, what will the LATAM economy stand in the new international division of productive processes? What is Latin America? And then on the back of your head you will say, what is the Middle East and what is Egypt? Well, Latin America has gone, in short, through two processes of globalization. People tend to believe, and in particular the populist strands of thinking and political action, that globalization is a new phenomenon for the world economy. And this is a false historical basis for analysis, because between 1870 and 1929, there was a strong level of globalization as well in trade as in financial markets. What was the big difference? That the number of players today immersed in this rule of the game is much bigger, but the structure of the game was similar 100 years ago. Full integration of Latin America, but Latin America, yes, was part of the first globalization, as it is part of the second. Globalization 1 was broken in the 1930s, and there was a collapse of world trade between 1930s and 1950 and the 73 period, and was replaced by something that also talks to the 50s in the Middle East and maybe the Naserian experience. If my slide, you tolerate my adventurous incursion in your territory. That was the idea, where we are going to reproduce the phases of development of the North, and we got into import substitution. We will try to produce whatever we can domestically, we import the inputs, and we produce for the domestic market. We have big domestic markets. Even a country like Uruguay, that couldn't believe that there are 3 million already for 70 years, there are still 3 million, they did import substitution strategies. So this was based intellectually on Prebisch and the CIPAL based in Santiago, sorry, it's Chilean, they appear all the time here. Based in Santiago de Chile, the United Nations Commission for Latin America, that had this view that the terms of trade are unstable and secularly decay. In every single decade, my unit of exports will buy a lesser quantity of equivalent imports for consumption. I will have a problem of growth because I will exhaust my capacity of growth. That was but they didn't imagine that you could have a rise in the price of commodities that were comparative advantage in commodities could be a big advantage. So this was the base, but there was an essential problem of this logic, which the counterpart is Southeast Asia. If you didn't develop productivity gains to export to world markets, one day this strategy will hit a wall. Because if you don't export, your input capacities come to an end at a certain point, and you have balance of payment crisis. As you've seen many times in Egypt, you've seen before the 80s in the Treaty of Integration with US in Mexico for ages, and what we call the stop and go regime. Go is we expand the economy, imports expand, because we don't export. We are not dynamic exporting, we hit a wall, problem of a lack of dollars, adjustment, many times IMF visiting the countries to assist, and then a new wave of go will start, but this will be all short term. Stop, go, stop, go. Southeast Asia, starting with the post-war Japan, and then the model of South Korea that extended finally to China, had a link between import substitution and export-driven growth. And that stabilized the process of growth while developing industrialization. In the 1970s, the failure of this process was invading most of the Latin American countries that adopted the strategy, including Brazil. Brazil was the latest one for a simple reason. The biggest domestic market gives you more mileage. I made a study on the termination of crisis. Who was the first in crisis? Obviously the smallest one, Uruguay. Since the 50s it couldn't go forward. Chile stopped in the early 70s, Argentina stopped in the late 70s, and Brazil in the early 80s didn't grow anymore with the smaller. So in a very simple way, the size of your domestic market was the limit of this strategy. Is the future back to Prebisch? That means we've been having a commodities boom lately, and the question is, will the Prebisch view that commodities cannot sustain growth back to the scene? We are going to try to respond to this question on a look on 30 years. The answer to this is a fundamental question mark for all the Latin American countries that have economies based on metals like copper, other minerals, or food like the Mercosur, and or energy, Colombia with oil, or Venezuela with oil, that has other problems to compound with this. What were the integration should we look forward? It depends on the expected terms of trade. If Prebisch is right, once again, we should expect a decay in the terms of trade, and we have a big question mark of what is the strategy for the future. If Prebisch is wrong, the comparative advantage in natural resources may not be a course if we have a good governance, and maybe is the way to go forward. This shows very quickly the shares in world trade of Latin American countries in different periods since the first globalization. What we see is, on the right, so I go a bit quicker, is Latin America gained world shares. Look at Argentina, 1870, 1.5% of world trade. 1929, before the crisis, it multiplied the world share by 3. That means that you're growing much faster than world trade because you're capturing growing shares of the big cake. You look at the same with Brazil. Brazil lost shares. Chile had stable shares after Colombia increased shares. Mexico multiplied by 3 its shares. Peru, from after World War II, doubled its shares in 29. Venezuela, more or less stable, then it will explode with the oil discoveries. And the total is an increase by 50% of world shares for the region. In 29, there is a derail of world trade, and it collapses, and we go to the import substitution strategy. Look at the extreme case of Argentina. It will reduce by 5 times its share in world trade. So this is not a negligible effect of the strategy on your link to world markets. So globalization 1, you gain world market shares. After World War II import substitution, you lose market shares, you disconnect from world trade, and the big mistake of this is that world trade grew enormously after World War II. So you lost the train, you let it go by. After the oil shock, the crisis of this model starts getting Latin America back to world trade and new gains in world shares. Interesting enough, let's look at other temperate recent immigration countries, rich countries, that have a strong resource-driven economy, like Australia and Canada. They had similar dynamics during this period. And this is, for the people that tend to say quickly that necessarily raw material specialization is a course, we should look at Canada and Australia in the course of history, and there you have pretty equal societies, strongly developed, where still today they're strongly based on raw materials in terms of the specialization. But what is happening with world trade? World trade is not the same as before. In the past, typically, world trade was, if you import a car, the producer of cars will do the tires, the engines, the chassis, and the seats. And you will export something, you'll do the whole product. This word has disappeared. Today, the producer of cars, producer in any country, in Germany, in France, or in developing countries, eventually will start designing the car, but may produce the engine in Romania, will mix the chassis that was produced in the UK, will assemble all this somewhere, and will send it to a fourth place. There is a decomposition, a spatial decoupling of production. And this is a big change in the interlinking, and the people talk about value chains. This is value chains. How integrated are you to value chains? Mexico is a central example of this in its integration to the US consumer market. So there is a fragmentation of the production processes and a new division of labor that is completely different from the division of labor of the first globalization. The second characteristic is commercial services, other than transport and insurance, become tradable. You export accountancy, you export call centers, you export a lot of services. In the area, I was looking because a few days ago somebody said, look at the Middle East, so you tell us something about the Middle East. I was looking at Morocco. Morocco, because of the timeline and the connection and the bilingual effect, has a lot of services, and now is starting a new brand which is medical services. It's close to Europe, and its professionals are much cheaper than in Europe. So some people are coming either for aesthetics, for surgery, or for dental services to Morocco. It's a starting point, but there you see there is tradability in things that we didn't think were tradable. In India, you have services for a lot of companies in terms of commercial compliance, etc., etc. We're going to see one transparency shows that something people didn't realize. Argentina is developing a strong base. JP Morgan, for instance, is displacing 3,000 people to do the accountancy for a number of countries in Argentina because the high quality human capital is cheaper than in the north. So a lot of changes are happening, but the thing is that strong growth in information technology enables services, accountancy, finance, logistics. There are the quotes if people want afterwards. It's not my invention always. The other effect is diversification of the industrial activities in terms of localization. This is part of the work in this graph. Let me see if I can tell you quickly this. In the vertical axis, you have the revealed comparative advantage in services, and here you have manufacturing. Here you have a zero. It means that your economy doesn't have a comparative advantage and is imbalanced in terms of the industrial sector. Here you have a zero. It means in services you have a balance. It means that you export and import exactly the same. If you have a relative comparative advantage in services or in manufacturing, you will be up. Okay, you will be positive. If you have a disfavorable advantage, you will be down. If you are here, you are disadvantaged in manufacturing. If you are there, you are advantaged in manufacturing. Okay, what is Egypt? Let's start for. That's why I changed that. I sent you yesterday. You challenged me, and I went and looked for Egypt, Turkey, Tunisia, etc. I didn't do it originally. Here is Egypt. What does it mean? This is Egypt. The size of the ball is the size of your trade in the world. But look at the position. What does this say? Nobody got that.
Services compared to manufacturing.
Okay, so you have a strong comparative advantage in services, and you have disadvantage, you are in minus in manufacturing. What type of services, then it's another discussion. Is it the type of high-end human capital intensive, or is low human capital? The services sector in Egypt, I presume, is a lot of tourism. It's not the medical services or accountancy or financial services. Well, maybe yes, I presume myself. But let's look at Latin America. Where do you see Latin America? The whole Latin America is here. What this is showing has disadvantage as a whole in services and in manufacturing. Well, it's not surprising. It has a tremendous comparative advantage in agriculture and in raw materials, which is not here. I choose this instead of another combination just to provoke and shock. Here you have different countries. Uruguay, higher in services, a lot of tourism, but also informatics and software. So they have the lower end, but also trying to go the upper end because they have a good stock of human capital. Here is Peru, here is Chile. But let's look at the developed countries. Look at the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is not anymore an industrial economy. It's a service economy. Look at the US. The US is should not anymore be considered an industrial economy. Despite that it has a big industrial sector, its comparative advantage is not anymore in industry. Look at Spain, and who are Turkey? Turkey manufactures a comparative advantage in industry and also services in the wide region. What is happening? What is this? Korea. Korea is the industrial nation of today. China, the industrial nation. Who is still an industrial nation in Europe? Germany, certainly. France, knife edge. We don't know what's going to happen in the next 20 years. And the same with Italy. They are here. What we see is that I couldn't show here through time. They're moving this way. While Southeast Asia is moving this way, non-Germany continental Europe is moving this way. And the first mover this way is the UK, the first country with a decay in industry. So what is the result of this? This is an interesting thing. LATAM growing relevance in knowledge-intensive business services. This is what I was talking about, the Morocco incipient phenomena in the large Middle East. We see it pretty strong in Latin America. I'm not going to go in detail then with the questions, but here you have the rates of growth for a number of countries. Lately, Mexico as well is moving in this new service sector as a winner in high human capital services. The impact of this, let's first read down, is that nearly half of US jobs are at risk because of globalization. So the connection with the Trump phenomena and all the neo-populists, not only in the US, but also in continental Europe, is not only linked to this, but is certainly linked to the fear that the society feels of the threat of globalization. If globalization was put it at risk, maybe 10 or 20% of the working population in the countries, today, with all the transformation that gets into tradable services, is given to half of the population the perception that the next one can be me. And when that happens, fear installs and the space for the populist response grows. It doesn't come from craziness. Area below the curve shows total US employment. I'm not going to go into the details. Here you have the probability of robotization and computerization and the percentage of people affected in different sectors of the economy. And what you see is in the whole, you can go to 50% of the US economy is threatened. It doesn't mean they're going to lose their jobs, but there is competition with the rest of the world, a competition that we didn't have before. Transportation, logistics, as well as office and administration support are at high risk. Accountants in New York or in Delaware never thought that they could be at risk competing with some new developing country base. Well, today, yes, they can be displaced. Services, many sectors face risk of computerization, low value-added services such as contract control, basic accounting, and the call centers. You call to reserve today a ticket from Air France and you finish in Tunisia. I have fun every time I call and I say, where am I talking? Because they talk they talk sort of neutral language. One day I finish in Canada, another day I finish in Tunisia, another day. So this is showing you that this is not just something to come. This is now. Offshore in developed country problem, computerization and automatization, it's a world problem for developed and for underdeveloped economies. There is a question that I will leave to you as what I call the sandwich problem. The effect of robotization that is coming very strong sounds science fiction, but it's there. The speed at which robotization is coming into the production processes is enormous. The sandwich problem is the following. What will be the effect of robotization? There is a lot of controversies and simulations. Will be net contraction of employment, next expansion. It will depend basically on how much you substitute and how much growth you have in artificial intelligence, computation, and robotics design. But what is the sandwich problem? You are not cheap enough to prevent robotization, and you are not high enough to design the robots. There you are in trouble. Typically, a big chunk of Latin America has a sandwich problem. It's not cheap like Bangladesh or Vietnam or the low Southeast Asia, and it's not good enough in human capital as the upper end to capture the, we don't know this, but this leads us to the role of education further than the basic role of education. The issue is Latin America holds advantages in the primary sector, right? This, what we didn't have in the graphic is somewhere else, is in the primary sector. What is the problem? All these sectors are high volatility. With high volatility, oil, gas, agricultural products, they have a high volatility of prices and quantities in time. Is the future sustaining the demand for primary products? What about primary products and technology intensity? What about adding to primary products biotechnology, design, computers, high intensity development of technology, diversification of products, counter-season production, changes, the people that give you 5 colors for the oranges, etc., to invade different segments of the consumer, introducing biotechnology and also pricing the products at different ends. How much layer there is for that? Globalization will have losers and winners across countries and within countries. Globalization's effects are more unpredictable and more subtle and sudden. They are very violent, and what we've seen yesterday in terms of the telecom innovation speed, we see it in different sectors. Potential effect in services is larger and more diversified than before. We've seen before. And that has a political economic consequences, that more people may be affected with what happens beyond their neighborhood. So the problem of international interaction and governance is a new problem beyond the ones we knew before. Will this lead to more or less inequalities? Everybody talks about the world is becoming more unequal, isn't it the case? And the neo-populists is to respond to that. Well, I will tell you, I'm not going to go in detail to that, but I recommend a book by François Bourguignon that shows that there is less world inequality. If you are true internationalists and we care about development, we should care about the fact that half of the population lives in more unequal conditions than 50 years before. But this is not what drives national politics. So we see more intra-country inequality, but less global inequality. So if we take the citizens of the world and we take away the boundaries, the world has never been less unequal. If we put boundaries, many people inside the boundaries are having more inequality. So there is a sort of paradox of a better world with people with more fear and with maybe challenges in terms of political processes. Adjustment costs through employment, well, the sandwich syndrome that I told you, wages higher than Asia, human capital lower than developed countries. Wave 1 of this problem was wave 1. A lot of people got trapped in the sandwich problem, typical Latin America. It got too late. Latin America has a very little chance in industry for the future. And that was industrial. But now comes the second wave. We lost the first train, for good or bad, but now comes the robotic sandwich. For the first one, Southeast Asia had the advantage because it had lower wages and produce equivalent human capital very quickly. This is the combination in a nutshell of Southeast Asia. Strong education and a strong level of savings. Latin America, decay in education, slow growth in education, even had an advantage 50 years ago, but very low levels of savings. Are wages set in emerging Asia? This is a big question. Where is the anchor with the global wage process? If everything becomes more integrated, paradoxically, we can do whatever we want, but labor markets become global too. Downward pressures on wages and delocalization, what we've seen in Europe. Automatization, wages, as I said, not low enough to prevent automatization, but human capital not high enough to develop tech to compensate. This has sovereignty loss and negative externalities. And this is politics all the way. We're losing sovereignty. But the question is to adapt or to screen. Tensions and potential conflicts across and within countries for the global share of the cake and the national share of the cake. Social and economic challenges. Well, this is where comes population growth in the coming decades. Basically, Latin America accounts for little more than 8% of global population and will account for 12% in 2050. I went to demographics, so I'm taking risk. I'm doing sort of unequipped economic imperialism. Economics imperialism, not economics. Latin America has almost achieved its democratic transition with a total fertility of 2.6 against 5 in 70-75. And there is something for the Middle East to discuss. Latin America was like the Middle East 40 years ago. It did the transition, in many cases with a sort of chaotic planning, family planning, or the absence of family planning. Just habit change. Like Brazil. Brazil didn't have a very effective plan. Brazil is a samba country, but it moves. But the fertility habits have changed dramatically. Today, 2 children per woman in Brazil, and they're getting close to the growth demographics of Europe. World population and income growth will be out of Latin America. What will be the case? That doesn't mean that Latin America is not going to grow. I'm going to look where the growth will come. We will have in 2050 2 billion Asians more and 2 billion Africans more. 4 billion people more in the planet. Strong income growth in Asia. What about Africa? So Asia will combine 2 drivers from world consumption. Numbers plus income. The 2 reinforce the demand of products through the world. In the case of Africa, we know numbers. We don't know about income. I'm not going to discuss in detail, but the net effect is that this is the future distribution of population in the world, where Latin will grow a bit, Northern America a bit, and Europe will decay in terms of total population. I'm not going to go into the discussion of immigration and Europe's sustainability. That will make another conference. Growing demand for food. According to I start lending, going and asking other professions for information, to the FAO, we will need a 70% increase in world agriculture production in 2050. Could Latin America increase its agri-production enough to satisfy some of this future needs? This goes central to the question of maybe commodity price volatility will still be high, but the level of the cake that we can sell is much bigger. And if Latin America has comparative advantage there, it shouldn't throw it through the window. It should see how it can capitalize on this. Strict limit in Asia for the extension of cultivated land area. Just one issue in the Latin American scene that I mentioned before, and I forgot, looking at the Ambassador of Mexico. Just look at this quickly. Strong comparative disadvantage in industry seems exclusive for new developing economies and some Asian economies. Disadvantage in services to be explored, the combination primary sector plus services and technology. This is also a question for developing countries as well. Let's try to put into question the phases of development a Rosto, that everybody has to repeat the development process of the industrial today developed nations. Maybe it's too late to do the same. I'm not saying you shouldn't, but it doesn't seem to be given to everybody. But interesting why Mexico, I mentioned. Mexico suffers competition from Asia while Mercosur is complementary. So you see, Latin America is Latin America, but they have different strategic interests. Because the Mercosur is tied to the Chinese growth process with commodities, as well as the Pacific area, and it's not surprising the development of the Pacific Agreement, free trade agreement, because the Pacific area is also tied to world growth. And Mexico is today a competitor of China in the big markets. They went running nuts. Very quickly, where will come to production? Let's look at land. I'm going to look at funny issues. Asia will buy more because of 2 billion people and very high rate of growth of income. So this is a multiplier for the demand that we are seeing in world markets. But they don't have the land. They don't have the land to produce this. When you see China going into Africa, trying to develop, buy land in certain countries, make agreements, going to Latin America to secure land and sources, is this. They don't have it. So, in the past, this was solved by colonial wars. We hope that in the future, it can be done through better means than war. LATAM accounts for 23% of the potential world arable land and 17% of the pastures. So Latin America has a good stock of the physical capital needed to support an increase in production. But only 10% of the world cultivated land. What does it mean? Latin America can more than double the cultivated land with the current stock in the current conditions, without changes in technology. But land is not enough. And that's why I talk about Malthus here. Land is not enough. Where is the water? I need water to renew the land. LATAM has 1/3 of the permanently renewable fresh water in the world, in the planet. So, not only has the land, but has the fuel to support the land. There is the distribution of water is there, I don't go into details. Excess supply of renewable water resources in Latin America. Many years ago, I heard some people that from a very radical point of view said, the imperialism will come here to get our water. And I said, well, this guy's always seeing conspiracies. And now I don't see the conspiracy, but I get interested in the connection with water supply and the sustainability of the explosion in population. So that gets that Latin America is the region of the world with sustainability of the extension of cultivated area. So, I call the agri people. What this Latin American gains of cultivated area productivity between 2000 and 2050? What are the simulations of the capacity to increase production in Latin America? And these are 3 simulations of the world agronomists. From doubling to tripling production with hypothesis of productivity and surplus inclusion. So Latin America has the means to respond to the demand, and no other region in the world has the means. Actually, I'm probably exaggerating. Parts of sub-Saharan Africa have the means. I'm not going to get into the detail. They have quality of land to participate in this process. They probably have a serious problem of governance that will impede it, which is unstable property rights. You don't sink capital to make land produce if your rate of discount is extremely high. So sub-Saharan Africa is a possibility, but is not, in my view, I wouldn't put my ticket in that share. In terms of natural resources, so we have world population and income growth. LATAM increase in export-driven agriculture is a base, as well as metals. You can extend this to metals. But this has a problem. For that, we need deforestation, and deforestation affects climate change. Higher wealth, I don't see there. This will produce higher wealth inequality. Why? Because in some places of Latin America, you will have to appropriate indigenous land that is today still occupied by the original people. This thing will produce climate change because you will have to deforest. When I'm saying that you can double, it means that the land is there, but you will have to clean it up. This is what is happening in the Amazon today. There is a movement of the landowners in the south of Brazil to much cheaper land than the Mato Grosso. So they sell 1 acre and they buy 5 and they become big landowners in the north. But for that, they push out the indigenous people and they deforest massively to put this land into agricultural production. So here we have two problems. One is local governance. In certain countries, conflicts inside the countries between the development potential and the people in the region. But we also have a global governance. For how long Brazil will manage to say that it will govern the Amazon that affects the provision of air in the planet? Will one day, maybe not Trump, but somebody else, say, listen, the Amazon is too important for the planet. You cannot do on your own whatever you want. You're producing negative externalities. So we have global governance problems and local governance problems. Just look at this.
Please try and wrap up maybe in the next few minutes just to be
Okay.
able to have enough time for discussion.
5?
A few minutes, I would say 5 to 7 minutes maybe.
Okay. LATAM has 22% of the forest, of the world forest, 52% of the tropical forest, mainly the Amazon. So Latin America is a global problem because climate change is a problem, and they have 50% of the forest. The producers and absorbers of carbon are in this part and affect global climate change. But without policy intervention, in 2008, McAllister made a simulation of what is the impact of current deforestation in the Amazon, and he sees that forests may be destroyed or degraded by half of this part of the 50% in 2030. This was in 2008, this was in 20 years. Here you see the rates of deforestation, and interesting enough, Brazilians always get surprised. Look at the average rate of deforestation here, and look after McAllister. So the word is not only bad news, it just was shaped dramatically. Is this sustainable? Well, it's almost 10 years now. Maybe we are on a new trend, and Brazil is contributing in its samba way to better control of its governance, because if it goes on like this, for how long the countries of the world will let Brazil do whatever? And at the same time, it's contributing to contain climate change. Ethnicity and conflict. So we have climate change, let's get this one. This for the Middle East is, you will react. You probably have hours and hours of seminars of this. But the conclusion is, I use language fragmentation indexes and religious fragmentation. Well, the conclusion is the region has strong religious homogeneity across and within Latin countries. There are countries with fractionality, but in Brazil, for instance, there is a competition and market for religion, very, very competitive, with the evangelists growing at a tremendous speed at the expense of the Catholic Church that detained the market for 400 years. And they grow at a tremendous pace. But it doesn't come to any violent type of, it's like an industry. They have their televisions, they have their rhetoric, they sell their products, and they win consumers. And it doesn't come to shooting. No religious conflicts in the whole. High levels of ethnic fragmentation in some places. Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, Mexico, Guatemala have higher levels of ethnic fragmentation because of polarization between important indigenous populations and the immigrant population. In certain of these countries, the big difference probably with the Middle East, I don't know the numbers, is there is a lot of mixity. So a country like Brazil is a very nice story of a census 25 years ago when they wanted people to identify as blacks, whites, etc. But they didn't want the tester to say the color of the individual, so they said, you people have to define yourself. The census was a disaster because they retained 155 ounces. Because the people say, well, I'm 32 this, 23 that. But the interesting thing is that people perceive themselves as a mixture, and that diluted certain types of conflict. In certain places like Bolivia, we have, and now the experience of Evo Morales is an expression of empowerment of indigenous people. The sign of hope that you see in this type of fragmentation is the political awakening of indigenous people, but in the midst of democracy. I didn't mention Chile there, but in the south of Chile they also have their problem that the Chileans, sometimes I have the feeling, refuse to see the risk and they radicalize. The ambassador then will contest this, sure. So, but in the end, and even we see little bits of separatism. But the funny thing is that the separatism in Bolivia now is coming back, is of the immigrants against indigenous that took over after 500 years power in the country, in the Santa Cruz region. But it was apparently solved. Urbanization and crime. 80% of Latin America is urban. So the transition to the urban society is done in Latin America. 14% of the people live in mega cities, and that poses a problem that in this visit to Cairo, I think, is the same. Mega cities are a governance problem. Mexico City has a problem of management with such a high, over 20 million people. Sao Paulo has, and just crossing Cairo, I see a serious problem of governance. Strong insecurity feelings, and Latin America is the worst case. Here we have a poll of perceptions across the world. Latin America is in the average of the satisfaction of its people in public transport, roads. Here you can read the average. Middle East is here. The degree of satisfaction in different indicators of public services, etc. And Latin America is more or less in the average here. Latin America relative to work pattern, 5% up, down, etc. Where is it completely out? a question asked is, walking alone at night, do you feel secure? Latin America is significantly out. Latin America is worse than sub-Saharan Africa. So, security is a problem. Signs of hope. Water quality is close to the standard of the developed countries in Latin America as a whole today. This is a revolution to have sane water. Adult literacy rate is similar to developed countries, 91% is the average for Latin America. Urbanization, crime and violence. So crime is a problem. What do we see? The levels of crime are much higher than any region in the world. But what about security forces? So they're interesting enough. Confidence in the public police is also the lowest in the world records. If you look at confidence, Latin American confidence in the security forces is here. Look at sub-Saharan Africa. It's much poorer. Obviously, if you go to the developed world, they have even less confidence than in the Middle East. So this is a serious social problem to tackle, and it's not difficult, it's not easy to do in the next 20 years. 1 minute. Public safety is the main concern of the population in almost half of the countries of the region, including Argentina, Brazil. And there, I have one question to say, is when you make tests of perceptions, people may have, you compare levels or changes. People may be very dissatisfied, like, for instance, in France. If you ask today if people are concerned about security, it will come top of the range. But it may be linked not to the level of objective, but of the change. It is worse than before, but maybe still much lower than average. And some people get accustomed as much to success and decay, as said at the beginning, to a high degree of insecurity. But the issue is, how much does this cost from the point of view of income? There is an interesting study by a Colombian economist, and it could cost 25% level of per capita income in Latin America if it could go back to the average crime rates of the world. So it's not only a problem of security, it's an economic problem. Most of Latin America has excessive high violence. Interesting thing, this study by 2 Brazilians that find that the 2 main drivers that they observe is high income inequality, low incarceration rates, and small police forces. What you get here? You get the programs of the right and of the left. And actually, as usual, many times it's a mixture of solutions. What will the left read in the populist left in Latin America read here? Income inequality. What will the populist right read here? Low incarceration rates and smaller police forces. This I'm not going to get into, just a discussion if it comes of what Latin America has a long history of populism, and maybe is a precursor that we never thought that we'll have a comparative advantage in export to these days. So if there are questions, then we can go into this, because populism today is colonizing the political life of many modern countries. So what is the experience of Latin America? There is a problem with the technology. So at the end, what all this fresco story of Latin America to 250 is telling us, we have problems of local governance and global governance. Water, land and rainforest, crime and ethnic conflicts lead to local governance problems. Climate change and the exhaustion of raw materials may lead to global governance problems. Thank you.